All right, let's get this thing started. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan, co-founder and chief product officer at Clever. Back in a prior life, I was an eighth grade science teacher and tech director in Denver, Colorado. Today, I am so excited to have Jess Gartner as my first guest in Clever's Elevating EdTech series. Jess is a world-class expert in one of the areas that mystifies many EdTech entrepreneurs, how districts spend money. Jess is co-founder and CEO of Allovue, and there she builds software that gives district leaders insight into how their money is being spent. So not only is Jess an expert in district budgets, she's also a phenomenal chief salesperson at Allovue. She's pounds the pavement to sell her product to district leaders, and she'll tell you not to sell the product, but instead to partner. We're going to learn a ton from Jess today. I'm really excited. And in just a second, I'll ask Jess to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her founding story. But first, I want to take care of a few housekeeping details. So for the first half of this webinar, I'll be asking Jess some questions, some things I'm really curious about, so I'd love to learn from her. But then around halfway through, I'm going to hand the mic over to all of you. So please, when something comes up, when you have a question that you'd love to learn, something you'd love to learn about from Jess, please post that question in the chat. We're monitoring that throughout the whole webinar, and we'll be grabbing the best questions and getting them ready to ask Jess at the end. And you can also tweet at us. If you tweet at Clever with the Elevating EdTech hashtag, we'll also keep a note of that, and any questions that come through Twitter, we'll also add to the queue. And then last but not least, don't worry too much about scribbling notes during this webinar. We're going to record it and we're going to send it out to you afterwards with a quick survey for your feedback. So really excited about how things are going to go. And without kind of waiting any longer, I'm going to hand things over to Jess. Jess, can we hear you?
I hope so. Can
Loud
you hear
and
me?
clear. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Allovue and how you got started.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for a really lovely introduction. I am pleased to be the very first guest on the Clever webinar series. So thanks for having me today. A lot of people are somewhat surprised by Allovue's origins. Contrary to popular belief, I did not come from the finance and accounting world. I came from the world of education, just like you. I was a teacher. I was a middle school social studies teacher in Baltimore. And one thing that continuously perplexed me and kept coming up in my teaching career was the availability or lack thereof of resources, whether that was copy paper or technology or textbooks or curriculum. I noticed that there was a really different profile of resources from one school to another, even within the same district. And so I started asking a lot of questions about finance and budgets and resource allocation in general. Who makes these decisions? How do we evaluate whether these decisions were effective or equitable? And what I found was that about $650 billion in education finance data pretty much looks like this, which the last time most of you have probably seen a slide like this was probably in the trailer for The Matrix. It is just rows and rows of lots of numbers, no words in many cases. So this is not only is this not very user-friendly, this is not very human-friendly. But computer software, it tends to be very good at taking very large volumes of numbers and turning it into something that is a little more human friendly. So we take these large volume exports of financial data and we make it look a little bit more friendly. So you'll see on the next slide, there is a quick snapshot of our dashboard. And we use things like plain old English words and colors and charts and graphs to make it really easy for the educators at the table to help access and understand financial data, particularly dollars that they might be managing for their school or for a particular grant. So our mission is rooted in ensuring student success by empowering education administrators to strategically and equitably allocate resources. And we do this with a combination of technology products, but also services. If you can jump ahead a couple of slides here. So we have currently our main product suite is called Balance, and we have 3 different modules called Budget, Manage, and Evaluate, intentionally pretty self-explanatory. And these tools all directly integrate with the district's ERP or accounting system. So we pull data at the account and transaction level in nightly for our reporting and analytics tool. And then the budget tool, we also pull in a lot of HR data from the HR system so that districts and schools can work on their staffing assignments, which tends to be a pretty big chunk of the district budget. It's usually 80 to 90%. So all of these are designed to work really seamlessly with the existing infrastructure that the district has, but in a way that's a lot more user-friendly to people that don't necessarily have finance backgrounds. So currently, we are helping school districts budget and manage upwards of $10 billion for over 1 million students across the US. This amounts to about 2% of K-12 transaction level data. And we work with districts of all shapes, sizes, urbanicities, and geographies. Our smallest is about 900 students. Our largest is almost 300,000. And we're working in about 22 states. And across these partners, through use of our tools and our partnership services, we have helped districts find, fix, or reallocate hundreds of millions of dollars. And some of that is finding unspent money that they didn't know that they had in grants that were about to expire. Some of that is bringing accounting errors to the surface or reducing duplicates in budget, particularly on the staffing side. That's a very common problem, or finding ways to reallocate dollars more equitably so that dollars are reaching students based on the needs that they have when they go to school every day.
That's awesome, Jess. Thanks so much for the amazing intro. I think that's kind of a dream that we all have, that we can help deliver that much quantifiable value to schools and school districts, and hundreds of millions of dollars is just incredible. And you know this, but I really see us as kindred spirits, starting companies that deal with really sticky data problems that cause real pain throughout school districts, but aren't really the first thing you think of when you think of starting an education technology company. So one of the things that I'm really curious about, and I'd love to hear from you, is how did you get that first district onto Allovue? Because I know now that when you have such an amazing presentation and great stats, I can see easily how you can go and sell to a school district. But when you weren't able to say, hey, we've saved these millions and millions of dollars, how could you get the first district on board?
Yeah, in fact, 6 years ago, when I first started out, Allovue was very little more than an idea and some sketches in my notebook. So you can imagine it was super compelling to district executives for me to walk in and be like, hi, I'm a middle school social studies teacher most recently, and I have some sketches on how to improve your billion-dollar finance budget. Want to talk? And a few crazy people did actually talk to me, which I consider a sign of how critical and pressing this problem was, that they were like, I mean, sure, if you're the best we've got on this problem, I guess we'll take it, because anybody would be better than nothing.
I think that's a great idea, that you're in a market that really needs you, is when you're wildly unqualified to solve the problem, which is totally how we were in the early days of Clever, but people will still take your call. That means that maybe you're onto something.
Yeah, it was definitely a sign that we were onto something, because while nobody was obviously going to buy my sketches at the time, they were very willing to share the extent of the problem and the pain that they were facing. It really took us about 3 years until we actually signed our first full-scale district partnership. In the interim, we were building the product, we were testing. Some districts were generous enough to give us some redacted test data sets that we were able to use to test and build the product along the way, and have some data in there to show people what this could be in real time. And we also started to build some credibility by doing work on the services side. So we did some work on helping to revise charts of accounts in the district, which was that was a service that my founding team actually had experience doing in other places for state departments and for districts. So that was a little bit of an easier sell in the earlier days. But our very first product partners really did take a big leap of faith on us. And I think in order to get to that point, a couple of stars have to align. One, you have to find a partner where this really is a critical pain point for them, where they are maybe willing to take a little bit more risk than normal, because
even a little bit desperate, I'd say.
Yeah, it's a problem of like, okay, you know, we're willing to take a risk on this brand new company that's never actually even done this with a district before, because trying a solution that might fail is better than doing nothing. And I think you also have to find those visionary leaders who are on the, you know, who are the early adopters of the world. And you know, this is a pretty widespread heuristic for where people fall on technology adoption these days. But with new technology, and particularly in an area where you're talking about not just new tech, but really a new market. And Dan, I think you guys were similar in this, in that you know, you were pretty early to the single sign-on idea, right? It was a totally new concept.
Yep.
So it's very different than selling somebody a better version of something that they have already. What we were offering is really categorically different, and that requires a lot of imagination and a lot of vision on the part of the partner as much as the founders and the company, because so the solution, even when you first go to market, the solution is still maybe half-baked at best. It's still, you know, it's still pretty rough around the edges. It's still missing a lot. And so you have to find those innovators who can see where you're going and who are willing to help you build the rest of it together. And, you know, you can see this is the 2.5%. So figure literally 2 or 3 of every 100 people that you talk to in the early days are even going to be willing to have that conversation with you.
Totally. And of course, for people on the webinar, there are tons of amazing books. Jess may even tell us about some that talk about this, you know, everything from disruptive innovation to crossing the chasm, things like that. I think one of the things that to me is most fascinating about this stage is that and one of the biggest challenges for being an early stage entrepreneur, probably something very resonant with many people on this, is when you're getting a no 95% of the time, that might mean you have a terrible idea, or it might mean you're just talking to people who are in that early majority, late majority, or laggards, and you need to be talking to innovators and early adopters. And so I think one of the real challenges for entrepreneurship is how do you find those innovators, because and those early adopters, because you really need both. Sometimes things that are innovator only appeal only to innovators, they're never going to reach mass market appeal. But if you can get innovators and early adopters, you got something really exciting. But you have to really develop an intuition around who those people might be to be able to get good signal. Jess, for your market, who exactly is your buyer, and where do the innovative versions of your buyers, where do they hang out? How did you find them?
It is pretty evenly split for us between superintendents and CFOs or budget directors. You know, a couple different names there. Maybe it's director of finance or executive finance director. And roughly where we've found the split to be is that in smaller districts, which we would categorize as under 10,000 students. In those small and medium-sized districts, the superintendent tends to be the person leading the charge. They're the big strategic leader of the district. And on the larger districts, it's more often that we're dealing with the CFO, who really plays a much more strategic executive leadership role in the organization. And of course, there's outliers, and we see some folks that are, you know, incredibly strategic leaders in smaller districts as well on the finance side. But by and large, that's roughly where we see the breakdown of who's bringing us into these districts. So on the superintendent side,
I just want to pause for a second to say, I think that that insight is so true, not just for your business, but for anyone who's selling to school districts, that the smaller the smaller the district, the more likely it'll be the superintendent who's making a purchase or driving a purchase. And then, if you're talking about a mega district like a New York or a Chicago or an LA, you might have someone who's 2 or 3 levels removed from the superintendent, who actually has the budget, the authority, and the time and the expertise to drive a purchase of a kind of specific product. And so you have to really be able to maybe pick a size of a district, or be able to have that superintendent general conversation, or that really budget nerd or reading nerd, or whatever your product might be conversation as you get down into the a bigger district. I love that insight.
Yeah, absolutely. And by far, and even to this day, the place where we find most of our partners is meeting them at industry conferences. Educators love to learn, and education administrators love to continue learning and professionally develop themselves as well. So we love going to conferences where we can share our ideas, share our work, and in the earliest days, again, those people that are going to see, pick up what you're putting down and see where you're going are going to kind of be drawn to you, and then you can start those conversations.
And I just want to back that up 100%. Conference season is upon us, and I mean, it's not, this is probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but I feel like half of Clever is going to be on the road for the next 4 or 5 months. For us, the big conferences are ISTE and COSIN and IMS Lilly. I'm sure for you it's a different set, but that is totally the place where you get to get amazing customer feedback and empathy. You get to develop new relationships, maintain the relationships you have. And I think if you're going to do district sales, conferences are critical. And I mean, we could probably do a whole webinar just talking about conference strategy, but I'd love to hear maybe your top 1 or 2 tips from your early days doing district sales. Maybe what's if you could give entrepreneurs one piece of advice for going to a conference, what would you tell them?
Sure. So the irony of this is that when we were first founding Allovue, I never in a million years would have guessed that this would be part of my role. Perhaps totally naively, but I mean, I think the last thing I had sold in my life was probably Girl Scout cookies walking around the neighborhood as a kid. So I was like, well, I'm certainly not going to go out and sell enterprise software. I don't know anything about that. I assumed there was this like magic skill set that they taught you at, VP of sales school or something. And the funny thing is that I was totally terrified of this, and I realized that the relationships that were really moving along the furthest and where we were getting the most traction with people were the ones where I was sort of doing it by accident. And I eventually figured out that there is no secret magic formula to sales, that it actually is most successful when you are just yourself and you're really authentic and you have a sincere desire to solve problems for people. And those things I can do. And one of our board members often jokingly tells me that my CEO title stands for Chief Empathy Officer, because one thing that I absolutely love to do is to sit around and hear people talk about their finance problems all day. And I love this because I get so excited by the potential to partner with them to help solve those problems. And so to me, I hate the word sales, because to me, like, sales is very transactional, and it has to do with commodities. And to me, this is so much more about building deep, authentic partnerships and relationships with people. And my background is in theater, and so Theater and political science, which lo
Yeah.
and behold is mostly about, building relationships with people
Yeah.
in an authentic way. So,
Yeah. So just
so
what does that mean? What does that mean when in practice? Like how often are you on the road?
I'm probably on the road between 160 and 180 days a year.
Wow. And that's all meeting with districts, meeting with current customers, meeting with prospects, and building those relationships.
Yeah, all of the above. I am a bit of an old-fashioned gal in the sense that I still really deeply believe in the value of face-to-face contact. She says on a webinar, but I really love, I love floating around the country and getting to see where people go to work every day and get to talk to people in real time, in real life, and get to know them as human beings. And to me, that's how we solve these really deep, thorny, complex problems together. It's not going to be done over email in all likelihood.
And I've found that the things that people will share with you in terms of their hopes and dreams or their embarrassing challenges in person are just completely different than the things that they'll share over an email or even over a video conference call. There's something about sitting in someone's office, both having that physical presence and that human connection that really allows you to go deep and to really start to build relationships. And I don't get out on the road as much as you do, but I do every single time I'm out visiting a school district. I know that it's an amazing and energizing thing for me and a really powerful thing for them as well. So I love this. And maybe one last thought on selling. I know that some entrepreneurs have asked me questions and will say things like, I just built my product. And I've been hearing from these sales consultants, or I'm now that I have my product ready, I'm going to hire my first salesperson. And oftentimes I kind of say, I actually think that you should be the first salesperson. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. When's the right time to start? When should founders be the ones to go out and sell, and when is the right time to kind of tap into experts?
Yeah, I think this is a total necessity, and this is actually a mistake that I personally made because, as I said, as recently as 3 years ago or so, I just couldn't imagine myself being able to do this part of the job competently, and I had a lot of insecurity about that. And what I eventually learned was that in those early days, because things are still taking shape and they're still a little half-baked, they're still a little rough around the edges, if you are trying to get those early innovators to buy into the vision, the founder is uniquely qualified to do that. They're uniquely qualified to tell that story, to connect with people, to convey that passion of why this is necessary, of why the world needs this, of why you need to be a part of building this. There's no one that will ever be able to do that as effectively as the founder. And what we actually ended up finding a lot of success in doing is our first successful sales hire was actually an operations focused person, and she basically followed me around for a year and helped operationalize everything that I did. She really helped package the story and the process so that it was something that could be adopted and replicated with other folks on our team over time. And I do think that this is a shortcoming of the founder too, is you sort of don't know what you know, and it can, when somebody says like, well, what do you do? You're like, oh no, I just go in there and talk to people.
I know that
And that's super unhelpful in terms of training anyone else ever.
Yeah.
So basically, our director of operations just kind of shadowed me for a while and helped template and process and document everything that I did. And it started to get to a point where we had a really repeatable process. And at that point, we were able to insert other people into it.
Yep.
And really build out that part of the organization.
Cool. Well, first, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's submitted a question through the chat already. We've got some great ones that I'm taking a look at, and we're going to get to those in a second. But I do have a few more questions that I'm dying to ask Jess. Jess, let's try to go through these in lightning speed because we have some great questions from the audience. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Cool. Well, one that I know we really need to dig into is what are some of the most important things that anyone selling to school districts really needs to understand about school budgets? Your keys here, I think, are critical.
Yeah, so I think the four qualifiers that we look at are having a budget. It could be that this is something that is a priority for the district or for the person that you're talking to, but they might not have dollars budgeted for it this year. So you may need to wait a year or two to make that happen. Authority, is this a person who has the autonomy and authority to make a purchasing decision, or as we discussed earlier, might they need to go 2 or 3 levels up in the organization to bring in somebody who does have that purchasing power? And anybody in the district or the organization could be a really compelling influencer and a really compelling supporter to help you get to the right people and to help you move the process along. But at the end of the day, if they don't have budget authority, it's probably not going to happen for either one of you.
Totally. To know that, because
yeah,
you think the person has budget authority and you're talking to the decision maker, but really they're an influencer. Your actions are going to be so different, and your asks. And I know that I've personally spent a lot of time thinking that the person that I'm talking to is going to sign the check, but really what I should have been doing is asking them for introductions and connections to other folks in their department, or maybe their manager who might actually have that authority.
Yeah. Need is a big one. So is there a strategic alignment? Is this really a critical pain point for the person that you're talking to? Because the reality is that any purchase that is going to result in a long-term partnership is probably going to require some degree of change management at the organization, whether that means organizing people for training or making process changes. And so if there is no clear need there, you are not going to get people to collaborate with you to actually make those things happen. Where on the other side, if this is a really clear need and priority for the organization, it's a lot easier to organize those other resources.
Yeah, and one thing that I would add here that I feel is really a big one is there's different levels of need, right? There's a lot of K-12, one of the great things about it for entrepreneurship is that there are lots of challenges and lots of needs. But one of the things that I've found is that if a need isn't really like a top 3, then it's really hard for districts to find capacity to take something on. So, something like, oh yeah, that's a problem is very different from, oh, that is my number one problem. I have to solve it this school year or else. And getting a sense for level of need is a really important part of the sales process.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually to that point, you actually don't, as a partner, you don't want to work with somebody if you're the 20th thing on their list, because for these changes to be successful, people need to put in the work on both sides. To act like any of this stuff is just going to be like, yeah, we'll flip this light switch and then all will be good, unless you're actually selling light bulbs or light switches. That is probably not going to happen.
Or silver bullets. I heard that those.
Yeah, and organizations really do have a threshold for the amount of change that they can take on at a single time. The superintendent of Schenectady, Larry Spring, talks a lot about this. He actually has a whole calculator for thinking about the amount of change that the organization can bear at any time. And I think it's really something worth evaluating on the district side as you're thinking about adopting solutions.
Yeah. And then any last thoughts on timeline?
Timeline, I mean, I have found that the word soon is a very relative concept. Yep. Like for me, soon is like later today. And for some people, soon is like sometime this decade. So I think the more precise that you can be around what is your timeline for adopting a solution or for engaging in this partnership, the happier everyone will be, because time expands and contracts in startups and in districts, and it really helps everyone if you're on the same page with level of urgency and making in terms of adoption and rollout.
Getting to understand and really master the seasonality of school district purchasing, the summer rollouts and the spring conferences and the fall implementations, I think is something that took us quite some time at Clever, but is a really important thing to wrap your head around as an entrepreneur.
Just one last point on that, just like there's no rule for that either. I mean, we have districts that we talk to for the first time and 17 days later we're partnered with them, and I have districts that I've been talking to for 5 years and they're still telling me like any day now. So and like both of those are fine, right? Just there's lots of variables that go into those decisions, but it's important to be aligned on them.
Cool. Jess, let's make this one super snappy. I know that you've got a couple trends that you think every entrepreneur should probably know about when it comes to school budgets. Can you give us kind of tweet length summaries of those trends?
Sure. One big one that we're seeing is that as things like the new federal reporting regulations for ESSA are coming out, districts are starting to think really carefully about student-based budgeting or pushing more dollars down to the school level, which often results in more autonomy at the principal level. So going back to that authority piece, it may be that principals now have more authority than they had in prior years. And we're also seeing a big push around priority-based budgeting. So district school boards are increasingly asking superintendents and CFOs for things like ROI of dollars. So how do you know that the purchases that you're making are actually aligned to goals and priorities, and that we're seeing relevant outcomes as a result? So those are two big ones that we're seeing.
Yeah, I think that's maybe just to encapsulate that, if you can't tie your product directly to the district's strategic plan and to the goals that they have there, usually academic and engagement and things and operational. If you can't say, hey, this is your big goal and here's how my product is going to help with that, principals might be a better person for you to talk to and partner with. If you don't have that kind of district top level goal connection. I love that advice, Jess. And actually, we had a question from the audience about ESSA, so you hit that one on the head. You're psychic. Great. And last question I'd love to ask you before we turn over to the audience is, what are your best EdTech reads and resources? What do you recommend for folks who want to learn more about schools and budgets?
Sure. I've got a couple favorites. Of course, I have to plug our own blog and newsletter, the Bottom Line blog on our website. We really take a lot of pride in explaining some really tricky, complex concepts in plain old friendly language. The Afton
I love it. I read it and I strongly recommend it.
Thank you. The Afton newsletter is another great one that I subscribe to. They aggregate a lot of big finance and district related news. Bruce Baker, who's a researcher out of Rutgers that we really respect, recently published a book called Educational Inequality and School Finance. This one is definitely heavier on the academic side, but it is very, very thorough. EdBuild has been doing a lot of work at the state level. They recently published a big report that was making huge media waves about the disparities and gaps that we're still seeing across racial lines in the country to the tune of $23 billion. It's probably a lot more than that even. NPR has been doing a whole school money series on big concepts in ed finance at the K-12 level. Education Trust also puts out some really great interactive resources about education funding inequity. And I, of course, love and adore Marguerite Rosa's work. And out of her Edunomics lab, they produce a ton of great resources.
Awesome. And we've gathered all those resources and put them into a handout. So if you're attending and you're interested in the links and the URLs, check out the handout section in the GoToWebinar console, and you can see an easy resource, all these resources collected for your easy use. Great. Well, I think that this is the time to turn things over to the audience questions. Jess, thank you so much for your answers to my questions. I love it, and I feel like I've learned so much. And let's see what our audience is curious about. So, before we hand over to that, I do want to do a quick plug for the remainder of our Elevating EdTech Spring Series. We've got a few great folks coming up. Jeff Ralston, a fantastic EdTech investor and partner at Y Combinator, is next up. David Kofed-Wind is the founder of PeerGrade, and is going to talk to us about how to acquire teacher users for free or freemium apps. And then my wonderful co-founder, Tyler, and I are going to have a great discussion to close out the series about Clever's initial growth, how we grew from 4 to 1,000 schools in a summer. So please register. Registration's open for all of those webinars. If any of them seem like they'd be interested, I think they're all going to be fascinating. Make sure to head to clever.com/elevating-edtech to sign up. Great. So let's turn over to some audience questions. One of the topics that our audience is really excited about is conferences, and I think it's such a key to EdTech sales and growth. So let's try to get a couple more conference insights there. The first question that we'll take on the conference track is, what conferences do you recommend for district level, to meet district level folks? Part of the question was just for me to clarify the conferences I kind of threw out very quickly. But Jess, maybe you can think of what your top 1 or 2 conferences are, and I'll share kind of the top 1 or 2 on the Clever end. So actually, I'll share my top 3, and Jess, maybe you have a few as well. So my top 3 conferences: number 1, if you want to get to know teachers and tech coaches, or just want to go to the biggest ed tech conference around, ISTE is amazing. It's also overwhelming. There's a lot of money there and a lot of marketing budgets, but there are just so many teachers who are all excited to learn about new tools. So ISTE is one of my top 3. Second one that I'd recommend, if CTOs and directors of technology are someone you need as a purchaser or an influencer, the CoSIN conference, it's coming up just a few weeks from now in Portland, is amazing. It is the CTO, CIO spot to go. And then the last one that I will recommend is, if you actually like Clever, if your business really depends on partnerships and meeting other edtech companies and leaders, or if you're really looking for investment, the ASU GSV conference that's coming up in April is fantastic. And it's a pricey one. I wouldn't send your whole team, but it is a great place to meet a ton of other companies and explore partnerships and investment. Jess, do you have a couple favorites that you'd like to share as well?
Sure. We prioritize any conference where we get some one-on-one time or small focus group time. It can be really hard to find the signal in the noise in those uber large conferences. AASA is one that I actually think is worth going to. There's a ton of superintendents, assistant superintendents are there. It's a great place to go and set up meetings and meet with people. We've also really been loving Institute for Education Innovation. It's a great way to bring together partners and district leaders, and they do this sort of matchmaking thing where they match partners with problems or pain points that the district leaders have cited that they need help with. And on the finance and administration side, the ASBO conferences, Association of School Business Officials, are really terrific. They have an international one, and then they have at least one in almost every state. So we kind of rotate and do a different set of state-specific ones every year. And then, of course, I have to plug my favorite conference of the year, which is the Future of Education Finance Summit, which we host right here in Baltimore.
and it is a lot of fun. I had such a great time going to the inaugural one in Baltimore. You throw a great conference. One more quick question for you, Jess, on conferences before we move on from the topic. Do you have a favorite conference hack? In particular, you said you really value getting kind of one-on-one or small group meetings. How do you set those up especially if you don't know everyone in the industry yet?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is just doing some cold outreach and kind of giving people a sneak peek of what you do and what you care about. And I think people, superintendents in particular, get hammered with a lot of BS all day, every day, and a lot of cold emails. So I think being authentic and showing that you've done your research and you're actually sending an email to a specific person, and it's not just like some button that you press to send 10,000 cold emails out. Like, dear sir, we will be at XYZ conference next week. Again, you'd be shocked how far authenticity goes, and it will take you a lot longer, and it should take you a lot longer, because frankly, if you can't take the time to do a little bit of research to figure out who you're going to talk to, then you probably have no business talking to them anyway. So I'd say, yeah, do your research and show that you care and that you actually know who people are and that you care about their problems.
Yeah, and I agree with that 110%. And I would just add that I think one of the things that is probably second nature to you, but I want to call out as really explicitly, is that if you go to a conference and you think your job is to sit at a booth and wait for people to come to you, you're doing it wrong. The way that you need to do, what you need to do to really succeed at conferences is to prepare well in advance and work whatever ways you can, whether that's sponsorship or other creative solutions, to figure out who's going to be there and get a list of attendees. And then, just like Jess said, send really targeted, really thoughtful emails to those attendees a week or two in advance. Usually I'll spend a day doing that kind of research and email sending in advance of a conference. And what you want to do is you want to line up one-on-one meetings. Oftentimes the Starbucks in the hotel lobby is a great spot. And for me, a great conference is one where before I even get there, before I get on the plane, I have 20 or 30 one-on-one meetings scheduled with people I really want to learn from, people I want to get to know. And if I have those meetings scheduled, I know it's going to be a great conference. But if I don't, I know it's going to be a waste of time, because I won't have any control over who I talk to and who I get to meet with. So I think it's an awesome tip, Jess, and really appreciate you sharing that insight. All right, so we could probably, like we said, we could probably talk about conferences for a day, but let's talk about some other things that folks are really excited about. One question that came up that I thought was really fascinating was about your work on the service side, and how Allovue's first revenue wasn't a product sale. It sounds like it was actually some services, and even now I think your revenue is a mix of services and product. And we just loved it. What's your strategy there, Jess, and what advice would you share for entrepreneurs around services versus product, or services and product?
Yeah, especially when you're working with a district to really make a considerable difference in their process. As I mentioned earlier, that's going to require a significant amount of change management, and no matter how good technology gets, it's just not going to facilitate change management all by itself. You can't automate that. Yep. And so we have found that it's really helpful to scaffold some of the introductions to our product, and sometimes even before we talk about the product at all, we really dig in to figure out what's at the crux of the problem, because sometimes we'll find out that the crux of the problem is not the software access, it's actually the data structure. Mm-hmm. So we may go in and do some cleanup on the data structure, which frankly benefits us as a partner too. That's a really symbiotic relationship, because if we put a bunch of really badly structured data into a platform that's designed to read data, you're going to just be reading poorly structured data and analyzing poorly structured data. So doing some of that upfront work actually makes our products work better for our partners too. So that's a very mutual gain. And sometimes people they're not ready to make a district-wide shift. They need a little bit more time to process what's going on and think about what that rollout would look like and build internal support. And so it can be a great way to also continue to build the relationship with the district in a slightly deeper way, show them what it's like to work with you on maybe a special or short-term project. And then hopefully, you build that relationship, you build that trust over time, and you can grow into other parts of the work over time.
Yep, you go from being that vendor that's emailing me to that amazing organization that's helped solve one of my problems, and that trust and that ability to form a long-term relationship really follows. I love that. Another great question we heard from the audience is around special programs. So the question is, how can vendors help a school district utilize funds from programs like Title II, Title IV, I'll add Title I, if the vendor thinks that their product services qualifies under that programs? And just for folks on the webinar who might not be familiar, this is referring to federal grants that get made to school districts that are restricted in their use, but give really focused funds that might be a great fit for certain programs. So Jess, any advice for folks who are kind of think that districts might be able to use their federal grant money or other grant money to buy their product?
Sure. On that point, I would say make sure if you can equip districts with how those funding sources or grants might apply to your work, make sure that you've really done your homework on this and are providing a lot of specific details, because the district is held highly accountable to how they spend those dollars. And if you give them misinformation for the sake of trying to get a sale over the line, that can cause really damaging repercussions for the district over time. Something like that could come up in an audit. It could cause them to lose title funding over time if they end up out of compliance. So really make sure that you've done your homework and you are giving them completely accurate information on those grants, because if you're talking to a grants administrator who's maybe new and they're excited to hear that they might be able to use that source, but if you give them misinformation, that could end really badly for them. So please be responsible when you give guidance like that.
Yep, that's great advice. And one thing I would add is, I think we both talked about how outsourcing sales early on to a consultant or even to an employee is probably not the best idea. But this is actually an area where I think hiring a consultant might be really helpful, not to go out and do your sales, but to help you build a strategy that would, many founders, I'm sure, are not experts on Title I, Title II, or Title IV, but a consultant could be a great person to help you understand those programs inside and out, figure out how your product or your services align to them, and, build a really easy, set of resources so that districts could tap into those funding resources. So I think that might be a really great place to also seek some outside help.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. One question that I'm not at all surprised folks are asking is about funding and finding investors. And Jess, maybe you could give us a little bit of the fundraising story for Allovue. I know you have some fantastic investors, and any quick advice that you'd recommend to other edtech entrepreneurs.
Yeah, Dan, I think you and I had almost as opposite experiences as founders could have on the fundraising front.
Yeah, the East Coast, West Coast, I think, is a big part of that.
Yeah, it was not easy for me. We got our very, very first funding doing a local accelerator in Baltimore. We got $25,000, and I pretty much, as a combination of using that to pay some consultants to help me build out wireframes and working a lot of part-time side hustles to keep myself above water, that helped us get through almost the first year to the point where we had a near working prototype. And then I was also building out a lot of R&D and user interviews and things like that to couple with the prototype. And then I took that around to raise our seed round of capital. But my seed round of capital tripled in fact, over 2 rounds. That was really pretty much over the course of 3 years.
Yeah.
I would raise money in check sizes as small as $5,000, and I think we had one investor over $100,000, but we basically over the course of 3 years raised $2 million in seed capital, like $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 at a time. Not recommended, but you do what you have to do. The thing that kept me going was I really believe in this work. I really believe in this mission, and I'm not going to be able to make it happen if we die. So the important thing was just to survive day to day, week to week, month to month. And, sometimes you just pray that something's going to fall out of the sky and you live to see another day. And that certainly, we got lucky a lot of times. And yeah, you just have to be scrappy and spend as little money as possible without completely depriving yourself of experiences to meet partners. And you just keep going, and hopefully at some point you get your head above water.
That's incredible tenacity, and really, I think that this is a tough business. Entrepreneurship and edtech is a tough place to do this, and I love how gritty and how much hustle you had. But things have gotten a little bit easier since then, right?
A little bit. Still not totally easy. This is still, it's still a fairly new concept that a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their heads around. I think for us in particular, investors had a super hard time because most of them have they're finance people, and they often have access to some of the best finance products in the world. And so they're like, I don't understand. Like, what do you mean they don't have these products in K-12? So it was like this weird blind spot that a lot of the finance people that you would kind of expect to be most excited about this just had this total blind spot of being like, I don't understand. So that was a big hurdle to get over too.
Yeah, getting investors to understand the ins and outs of a K-12 school system can be a challenge. I've never done this. I don't know if you have, Jess, but I can even imagine dragging them along. If you can get an investor pretty interested, have them come with you on a school visit, meet with a customer or a prospect to really understand the status quo and how challenging things are and how much of a need there is for your product. I want to get through maybe one, hopefully 2 more questions because there's so many great ones. This one's from Brian, and it's what payment models work best for schools and districts when selling software? For example, would a monthly subscription work better over a one-time yearly purchase, or is there even another model that would work better than that? What do you think, Jess?
We have seen a preference for the annual model, and very few will go much beyond annual. Because a lot of state rules require them to only budget or commit to dollars within the fiscal year. You can kind of help them lock in rates for out years, but there's really no such thing as tying people into a multi-year contract. They can almost always opt out of it. But annual tends to be the preferred billing rate, and we use a combination of per pupil pricing and seat licenses depending on the district's situation, because a lot of their budget and financial structures look very different from an autonomy perspective from place to place. But per pupil pricing is the most popular one that we see.
And that makes sense because districts think, I get $10,000 per pupil per year, and they can, that's kind of a very usual way for them to think. And our experience has matched that 100%, that annual billing is definitely the most common, just because districts are very much on an annual budgeting cycle. Great.
Well, not only that, but this is a webinar for another day, but the purchasing processes themselves are often very cumbersome. So the less paperwork that they have to do, many districts are still issuing paper checks. And And there's a lot of paperwork that comes on either side of that with POs and things like that. So the less frequently that they have to do that, the easier it is on them.
Totally. And as an entrepreneur, it's actually great because, we all know cash flow is not easy, and getting a check upfront for a year of services is something that can actually be a real challenge to get in other industries. So it is one of the nice things about selling to school districts is that they will pay. Oh, sometimes it's a little bit hard to get them to send the checks, but once they do, it is his full payment for the year. Oh, I'm going to try to sneak in one more quick question, and this one is from David. David has found that in his experience, innovators are often not the folks with budget authority, and so he's had the most success finding kind of influential innovators and champions who will then kind of use their network to kind of motivate and drive through a purchase kind of bottoms up. And he was just curious if you had any tips on how to identify those kind of innovative champions within maybe a target district that you'd love to work with, and then how to kind of activate them once you find them.
I think it depends on the persona that you're talking about. So I think that those tactics look very different for among teachers, for example, than on the operations side or on the executive leadership side. But again, I think my unfortunate answer here is you got to pound the pavement. You got to go find those people. And you got to try to talk to as many people as you can. And it's slow work. But then once you start to find some of those people, then it starts to have a snowball effect, because those innovators tend to keep company of other innovators. And so, if you can find one person who's in that category, usually asking who their friends are is a good way to find the next set of them.
I think that's one of the best questions that you can ask. Who are your friends? Where do you hang out? Who do you collaborate with? I love it.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we are all out of time. I just want to thank everyone for attending. And of course, thank you, Jess. This was so much fun. You kicked this off with a bang. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom with our audience. Just a quick reminder, everyone, head to clever.com/elevatingedtech to sign up for the additional webinars in the series. We've got some strong folks who have some big shoes to fill. Also, if you have any questions or you want to follow up with me, I'm just Dan@clever.com, and I can't promise to have all the answers, but I can share the knowledge that I have and maybe point you in the right direction. And if you aren't already, we'd love it if you could follow us at Clever on Twitter. And Jess, what's Allovue's Twitter?
At Allovue Balance.
Fantastic. Thank you all for such a wonderful webinar, and see you in a couple weeks to talk with Jeff Ralston.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. Bye-bye.